Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to First Service Residential's Legislative Update webinar, 2020 Bills and How They Could Impact Your Community. Today's webinar will do a lot of work and focus to provide a recap of the 2020 Florida legislative session and identify some of the important bills that could impact your association's operations. My name is Bill Worrell, and I'm a director at First Service Residential, and I will be serving as your moderator today. Throughout the webinar, you may also hear from my colleague, Monique Johnson, who is providing technical support behind the scenes, and thank you so much, Monique. As you know, the world is relying heavily today on technology to stay connected, and companies are having most of their meetings the way we are having ours and hosting ours today. This creates tremendous loads on systems like the one we're using. If we lose a connection for any reason, we ask that you please be patient with us as we work to resolve the issue as quickly as possible. In addition, please don't worry, we will be recording today's session, and we'll make that recording available to everyone so you can refer back to any thoughts and notes, and we'll make sure you don't miss anything. And now to our presenters. Joining me today, first we have Tony Colici. Tony is special counsel providing consulting services to our company, and Tony coordinates our legislative lobbying efforts. Thank you, Tony.
Hi, Bill. Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And we also have Travis Moore. Very pleased to have Travis with us today. Travis is the president of Moore Relations. This is where he represents and advises his clients, including First Service Residential, on federal, state, and local governmental affairs. Travis, thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you, Bill. My pleasure. And thank you to all of you for joining us today.
Excellent. So as part of our commitment to the communities we serve, First Service Residential endeavors to provide the most up-to-date information on all matters that could affect community associations. This year, again, backed by popular demand, we are doing our annual legislative session recap today. This year's legislative session covered a range of topics, from emotional support animals to short-term rentals, certainly conversations we've been having a lot over prior years. And First Service Residential was certainly involved every step of the way, actively monitoring proposed legislation, educating bill sponsors and lawmakers, and advocating on behalf of the community association market as a whole. The information in this webinar certainly should be accepted as great operational and educational information, however, not to be used as legal advice. Certainly it's important for every association and board to consult their specific legal counsel with specific issues and questions regarding your association. And so our purpose today, we hope that this webinar provides valuable insights and information that everybody can take back one or two items to their community. We have a great agenda today. First, we're going to provide an overview of the 2020 legislative session, kind of a recap. In my opinion, a lot of great news as well. Certainly a lot of clarification that we've been looking for. Important bills that were passed, as well as bills that did not pass, so that we can be proactive and look toward what maybe we can expect in the 2021 legislative session next year. How you can be involved in the process. And then, of course, we have a number of questions that will be coming through today, as well as some that were already submitted. So we'll wrap up with Q&A there at the end. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Travis and Tony to provide us with that overview. Let's start from a high level on what took place at the Capitol in Tallahassee this year. Travis, if you could start us off, that'd be great.
Thanks, Bill. As you can see there, there were, again, a number of bills that were filed this year, about 3,500, and that's about typical. A little over 200 of those passed. Usually we anticipate about 10% of the bills that are filed actually are passed. And so it was a little less, a little fewer bills this year, which continues a trend that we've seen over the last couple of years where fewer bills actually get through the process and make it to the governor's desk. The legislature, fortunately, this was one of those years where the session started in January. Every other year, it's either starts in January or in March. Fortunately, this year, it started in January and was beginning to wrap up right as the COVID-19 pandemic was beginning to ramp up, and we were beginning to take measures here in the state and across the world actually to deal with that. So the session was able to finish basically on time. They spent a week, they went a little over by about a week, came back and finished up voting out the budget. So it did end there March 19th, as you can see, the 2020 session. The 2021 session won't begin until next March of 2021. The bills are now beginning to make their way to the governor's office or the governor's desk for his consideration. Another 50 of them, as we're going to discuss today, went today. The governor had said, normally the process is a session ends, those bills begin to make their way rather quickly to the governor's desk. And the governor, due to the coronavirus and COVID pandemic, they put a pause on legislation and said, let's hold up. We've got other things that we're now dealing with that are priorities that we need to take on. So it was not until really the end of May when they kind of put up the green light and said, okay, we can now start getting bills. And so bills started going about 20, 25 every other day or so. And like I said, today another 50 went. And so we really have about one more batch probably to go before all of them will have reached the governor's desk. The ones that have gone today that we'll talk about, typically the governor has 15 days to either sign a bill or veto it, or it becomes law without his signature. Those bills that have an effective date of July 1, since we're getting within that window, July 1 is coming, he has until the 30th of this month. So a couple more weeks, a little less than 2 weeks, to act on those bills. We had about 40 bills that we were following very closely for First Service that dealt with everything from vacation rentals, insurance, short-term rent, emotional support animals, a variety of things that affect common interest ownership. So we were very busy following all of those bills. And we're going to talk about some today that made it through the process, as you said, Bill, that we all need to be mindful of as we are working here in associations.
Great, thank you, Travis. And let's move in now to some of those bills that did pass. This first one, Tony, I'm going to ask you to start us off. Certainly a lot of conversation over many sessions, right, with regard to emotional support animals. I'm pretty pleased as a property management practitioner that we got some additional guidance this year and some clarification. Can you walk us through some of these updates this year?
Sure, Bill. This is obviously something that's provoked lots of conversation over the last several years. There's certainly a recognition that pets can provide great comfort to people that have certain emotional needs. But there's also a recognition that a number of people have misused the opportunity to have an emotional support animal to circumvent restrictions in communities on pets. So what happened earlier this year, HUD issued a guidance letter to provide some clarity around the process and to tighten up the process a little bit. And the Florida legislature followed suit with additional provisions, which will hopefully, like I said, tighten the process up, eliminate some of the abuses that occur in the past with regard to emotional support animals. And it's important to distinguish here between service animals on the one hand and emotional support animals. A service animal is a specially trained animal that provides assistance to an individual, such as a seeing eye dog comes to mind as probably the clearest example of a service animal. This particular legislation doesn't deal with the service animal aspect. It focuses on the emotional support animal, which under the new definition, under the HUD guidance, and also under the legislative provisions, a service animal, or emotional support animal rather, is one that's maybe trained or untrained, does work, perform tasks, provides assistance, and or provide therapeutic emotional support for people with disabilities. So a little more clarity around that, and perhaps the biggest aspect of this legislation is tightening of the controls, providing criminal penalties for owners who fraudulently attempt to qualify an animal as an emotional support animal, and placing limits on telemedics or out-of-state certificate providers. I read about an example of an association attorney who actually did some research on behalf of his client to expose some of the frauds and the scams that had been going on. And he actually submitted an application for an emotional support animal named Pluto to provide support to Mickey and Minnie Mouse. Certificate, paid the money for the certificate, and the certificate was issued. So again, this law and the HUD guidance will establish some limitations, require that an out-of-state certificate provider or telemedic has personal knowledge of the client and before offering to provide an opinion as to whether that client needs an emotional support animal. So a lot of good stuff in here. Is there more to be done? Yes, probably so. But this was certainly a good first step to tighten the process up a little bit.
A good first step, Tony. And I think also as we continue to progress, updating those screening packages and for communities to perhaps outline what acceptable documentation is now, and some sort of disclaimer reviewed by Associations Council that outlines the HUD guidance, as well as now in alignment with the Florida guidance, to help tighten up the process on site as well. This may mitigate some of the challenges, I'll say, that we've been having over the years with regard to bringing these animals into a community.
Absolutely, absolutely. Associations in the past have been afraid to ask, for documentation or proof, for fear that an owner was going to file a fair housing complaint against them for discriminating against their situation. So more clarity in the law certainly is a good thing.
Very good, excellent. Travis, any other thoughts or context around this, or do you feel comfortable with where we are? Anything that might come up next year, do you think?
Sure. I think that this is a first step. I mean, I think this is a beginning. As Tony and you mentioned, this was one of those issues that came really right out of our visits that we do with our communities. Each year after session, we go and before this year, we did a lot of those in person, obviously. And we were able to talk about the things that had passed, the things that hadn't, and get the dialogue going about what things were important for associations. And the number two issues, top two that we heard repeatedly, no matter what part of the state we were in, were vacation rentals and emotional support animals, and trying to provide some guidance to just what was becoming fraudulent activity. The legislature has attempted last year. We got very close. The problem was it was a little too broad. We were dealing with public housing, public lodging, transient public lodging establishments, as well as housing providers, apartments, associations, and that was too broad. And we had the lodging industry and others coming in, and we just could not quite work it out because they handle things quite differently. As Tony mentioned, the differentiation between service animals and emotional support animals, and then pets, is very exact and different. So we weren't able to get it over the finish line last year, but we stayed with it. And then, as Tony mentioned, we had this bill going through that dealt, again, just with housing providers. This does not deal with emotional support animals in airlines or in restaurants or in other areas of life that we see this, Publix or whatnot. This deals just with housing providers. And right in the middle of session, January 29th to be exact, HUD did issue their guidance. And we knew that was coming. In fact, we'd been asking and seeking guidance from HUD because as a state, we can only go so far, because as we all know, fair housing law is a there's federal fair housing law that we have to, as a state and as housing providers, have to adhere to. And so we can only go up to where the federal law will allow us. And as Tony mentioned, so often people were just going online, paying for a certificate, almost like a diploma mill, and printing out a certificate, going to the association saying, look, I have a certificate. I've got a medical stamp of approval on this. So you have to let me have the animal, the emotional support animal in the housing setting. And this now will provide us with the ability that alone does not, and because associations, as Tony mentioned, didn't want to get foul of federal fair housing law, would just kind of have to let it go. Now you don't have to do that anymore. Going just online without the person ever even seeing you through a visit, whether it's through a telehealth visit or an in-person visit, and building that rapport with that medical provider, just going online, that you can't do that anymore. So things like that. And then the other thing that Tony mentioned that I think is going to really help us as associations, at least in this first step, and as we move this thing further along, is the penalties. There were no penalties to fraudulently filling out these forms. This now provides where there are criminal penalties to the provider, the medical provider, if they did not see the person or just sign off on it. Also to the individual. It requires that every pet, you can't just say, okay, this unit is now allowed to have an emotional support animal, so now we've got 3. No, you have to go through the same process for every single pet, and it'll allow the associations the ability to request information. There's a form that they can use if they want. Again, you can't just deny if the person does not use that form, if they just provide you the information that's being requested in other ways. But it does provide now a process whereby we can kind of get a handle on this. And I do think the penalties will be a big thing. But lastly, Bill, I think this is something that will probably be going back and continuing to tweak. But finally, we've got the legislature clearly wanted to make sure that they were, if your documents say, this is a no pet facility and people are choosing to live there due to, allergies or other things, you're not allowed to now just use this process to just circumvent the pet restrictions. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about this. I'm sure the last thing I will say is at the end here, when we give some websites where you can go and look at these bills, I encourage you to go and look at you can look at the text, you can look at the analysis, you can look at all the information that's there, so you can get, we put up 4 bullet points on a bill that has, certainly, we could have put up 8. So it'll be imperative to take a good look at that.
No, good stuff. Absolutely. So appreciate that, and the alignment with the federal legislation as well. Let's jump into shifting gears here to insurance, House Bill 529. Tony, please give us a definition of this Florida Insurance Guarantee Association. And then I think we're also noting here, right, that this applies to the condominium associations, not to HOAs. If you could start us off with that.
Sure, Bill. The Florida Insurance Guarantee Association has been around for about 50 years. It was created to provide for a fund where an insurance company becomes insolvent. So in a condominium setting, if there's a claim and the carrier has become insolvent, FIGA then will step in and will pay the claim. Since the inception of FIGA, the dollar limit on condominiums has been $100,000 per unit. So that is what the most significant portion of this legislation was, doubling that amount to $200,000 per unit. And as we indicate there, it requires a loss event that leaves an association's carrier unable to pay the claims. FIGA steps in and pays the claims. FIGA is funded by the licensed and admitted property and casualty insurance companies in the state of Florida. So the funds that FIGA has at its disposal are those membership assessments against the individual insurance companies that are members, and also whatever assets might exist from that insolvent insurance company. So since its history, there have been actually over 600 insurance companies that have become insolvent yeah, and over $24 billion in claims paid out by FIGA. So it's a tremendous safety net for associations. And now in the condominium world, with the limit increased from $100,000 to $200,000 per unit, a very meaningful backstop in those situations where we're dealing with an insurance company insolvency.
I appreciate that. I think that this might not get a lot of press. However, I've been around long enough to remember in some tough hurricane seasons, for example, where we have seen carriers, fail and not have the ability to pay. And so I think for condominiums, this is a big deal to double that limit. So I believe good news here and something to be aware of for all condominium association boards. But for the HOAs, did you mention, Tony, that there's a higher limit already in place for our HOA audience, single family homes?
Yeah, I think Travis can speak to that.
Yeah.
Existing law does have a higher limit for single family homes.
Yes. We've been working on this for a number of years as well to try to maintain some parity with single family homes. As Tony mentioned, for the 50 years that FIGA has been around, since its inception, it was $100,000. That was the limit per unit for condos. And just as the economy and the economics of housing has certainly changed a lot in 50 years, and the value now of those units, we have argued and said this needs to be increased. Single family homes did get an increase a number of years ago to $500,000. Now, when you look at it, you can say, well, we got to 200,000, but not 500,000. So that's still not parity. That's not equal. You got to remember that a single family home policy is covering everything. It's covering the contents, everything is included in that insurance policy package. Whereas with an association, typically what you would have come into play is the association master policy, but then also those unit owner policies that are very important, those HO6 policies that deal, as we always say here in the state of Florida, from the kind of the paint in. So when you add that limit to the limit now of where we are with the 200,000 per unit, we start to get that parity that we've been talking about and seeking. This is one of those things that, like you said, it won't get a lot of press, Bill, unless and until there's a storm. And that's where typically the legislature is not proactive. And that was really one of the big hurdles that we had, is to try to have them do something ahead of a storm. This is one of those deals where if we had a storm like a Mexico Beach with Hurricane Michael last year, if that had hit in another part of the state and it impacted many more condominiums, then unfortunately, if some of those carriers had gone down, and what we've got a lot of carriers that have come into the marketplace, certainly since the last string of significant storms that every storm is significant, but the last big string that we remember from like 2004 to 2006, we have a lot of carriers that have come in that have not really been tested. And our concern would be, well, if those carriers go under and are not able to pay the claims, we would not want, well, here's your $100,000 per how many units you have. You guys are now done. And then the association is left maybe millions of dollars short and would have to, assess or come up with, drastic measures to try to get that value back. So this is one of those that we think that if the storm had happened, the legislature and the governor's office, they would have been running to Tallahassee to do this. So we're able to do it now. It's there in case there's an unfortunate circumstance where we have a storm and it affects an association and their insurance company, for whatever reason, is not able to pay that claim, then it would go into this, and then there's that almost, that backstop. I will also mention that this bill goes into effect July 1. It went to the governor's office, to the governor for his approval just today in that batch of 50 that I mentioned. So it's just now has gone. He has, because it does take effect July 1, he has until the 30th, as we discussed at the outset, to act upon it. We suspect that he will approve this. We've been working very closely with the governor and the governor's office. And then I failed to mention on the previous bill, that bill went just yesterday, day before, I think it was yesterday, on the emotional support animals. It too takes effect July 1, so he has until the 30th on that bill as well.
Good, excellent. And just so, emotional support animals, all housing, 718, 719, 720. The FIGA, the 529 is 718. Do I have that right?
Correct. This was
Okay.
this just deals with condominiums.
Got it. Okay. Very good. Okay. Let's move into Senate Bill 374 here, discriminatory association language. Tony, you've done a lot of work on this over the years. If you could, give us a little historical context and what does this bill provide for?
Bill, this is a good one. There are a lot of communities, particularly older communities, that may have provisions in their documents that are no longer enforceable. The one that jumps out right away is no children under the age of 18. That was, something that a lot of the older communities had in their documents. A lot of people may have bought in those communities, knowing that there wouldn't be children under the age of 18 residing in the communities. That all changed when the federal fair housing laws were modified I think in the mid 80s, that basically said that you could no longer enforce an age restriction unless you were qualified age-restricted community. And that meant, the most common one that comes into play in our community associations is the over 55 communities, which do basically allow for 80% of the occupied units to be occupied by at least one resident over the age of 55 to qualify. That's the basic qualification. In those communities, they can enforce age restrictions, but other communities that don't meet the qualifications established by the fair housing laws for the over 55 communities can no longer enforce the no children under the age of 18. Well, we may have a lot of associations that still have those documents and they've never got around to amending the documents, or they weren't able to amend the documents because they couldn't get whatever percentage is required to amend to participate. So those provisions are still there. And they may not be enforcing it, but the fact is they may be exposed to liability just by virtue of the fact that that old language still exists in their documents, and somebody looking at the documents can see that language and assume that it's being enforced. This legislation now provides a mechanism for an association to be able, through board action, to basically amend out that language that's no longer in compliance with applicable law. So it's a good thing, and associations should be talking with their counsel about what needs to be done to eliminate those discriminatory provisions that may still linger in their documents.
Yes, good, excellent. Yeah, another great positive step forward. Travis, we're working with a lot of clients that may have older governing documents, and it's always a challenge for us to get those documents updated. We utilize our technology and communication systems to get those votes, that Tony mentioned. We also go door to door, and I will say that it's never one or the other. It's always both if you're going to be successful to get these documents updated and something that's better for today's market. So I really love that last sentence where this provides a simpler method to remove such language. And your thoughts on that and what the legislature was working to help us with.
Right. And Tony really kind of covered it. And unfortunately, a lot of these communities and a lot of our communities it is almost virtually impossible to amend those documents. I mean, we couldn't get a group of I don't think my association today to agree that it's Wednesday. And so when it just apathy or whatever, they were not enforceable. I mean, obviously it's against federal fair housing laws as we've discussed, and they could not enforce them, but they're just still embedded there in those documents and can create problems, and certainly litigation and other things. And it was just the association was not being successful in getting them removed, just like they were having trouble getting anything amended in their documents. Another case, and really the case that brought this to light for the legislature, was in an old community in Tallahassee, called Benton Hills, and they had this language in there that said that it was Caucasians only, which obviously is not enforceable, not language that anybody in that association would adhere to now, and certainly the leadership of the association was not enforcing that. But when you go and when you're in that real estate transaction and you're at that closing table and those documents are shared with you and you're saying that you're agreeing with them and you're seeing them and have accepted them, well, at that closing table, the black gentleman buying into that note saw, I'm not going to go forward with this purchase. And it led to, obviously that sale not happening, a huge problem in the community where it became apparent that this was still there. How could we even allow this to still be there? The seller could have sued the association, saying you should have gotten rid of that, and why is it? So this just provides, as Tony said, a simple method whereby the board can take the initiative and the action that's necessary to remove that language and say, we're not, it's not enforceable, it's out, we're getting rid of it.
Yeah, and good for that gentleman reading the documents and taking a stand there and being educated on that process. I'll just add to this as well from a management perspective and from board members to give to you guys. This 374, as well as emotional support animals, and any of this alignment that now we're seeing converging with the federal level, I just want to continue to feed that back. Thank you. That is mitigating a lot of the question and conflict that we deal with our board members, and we sit around the table and try to figure out some of these issues. So every bill like this that we can take a step forward, and including into the future, to help mitigate those questions and help resolve those questions and bring clarity, it's just wonderful for all of us. So thank you. Okay, Monique, let's move into the new laws that are now effective immediately. This first one here is Senate Bill 476 with respect to law enforcement vehicles. Tony, again, probably doesn't get a lot of press, but something to be aware of, and I'm glad it's clarified.
Well, Bill, it certainly didn't get a lot of press because this kind of passed through earlier in the session before, everything that's happening in the world, the social injustice issues. This one may have had a lot more conversation if it was later on in the session. It basically precludes a condo or co-op or an HOA from prohibiting a resident in the community who happens to be a law enforcement officer from parking their vehicle in their designated space or in another proper space that would be available to that owner to park. So that's pretty simply what the law did. Travis can comment on the backstory with this legislation and the fact that it was whittled down a little bit, Travis, from where it started.
Right. And also, and I keep forgetting, I just want to mention that the previous bill, where we are in the process, the discriminatory language bill has not yet gone to the governor. That effective date is just effective upon becoming law, similar to the two that we're discussing now. So they're not up against a July 1 deadline. So I suspect after all these July 1 bills go through, it'll be going through in short order. This bill, as Tony mentioned, very rarely have I ever seen a bill of any kind, especially an association bill, zip through the legislature as quickly as this one did. I mean, it was to the governor's office and became law, in February, as the legislature was just trying to, was settling into session. This one was done. This came out of another situation, and as often is the case, legislators hear from their constituents. They'll read something in the press, they'll see something, and that's when they decide that action needs to be taken. And I would again then also caution that what you're doing as associations and as association leaders, is not happening in a vacuum, and it matters. And we're going to talk a little bit later about how your involvement matters in the legislative process at whatever level of government, but also there's the activity that you do. So many of the things that we have in the law now, whether it's flags and flagpoles, and this type of thing, comes from action or activity at the association level. So there was an association in the Tampa Bay area. There was a City of Clearwater police officer that had her cruiser, and she was parking it in her designated driveway, and the association said, nope, that is a work vehicle. And we clearly have a prohibition against work vehicles being parked at your home. So they began to fine her and other things that we would do to enforce rules. And when that became a press story, it immediately was picked up by legislators and a powerful legislator in that area. And he said, well, we're going to fix this. Again, associations, we're engaged, and we're in the halls every day, and we're there. And again, we were asked for our input into this, to say, this is what we want to fix, and here's our approach. And usually, as is the case, they're going to come at it with a sledgehammer, trying to deal with a gnat. And the original bill, as Bill alluded to, was just that. It was an act relating to work vehicles. And we said, well, that's way overly broad. We could end up with, plumbing vehicles and, again, perfectly great and wonderful professions. But, we could end up with a situation where any kind of work vehicle would be parked, and that we thought was way too broad. Certainly was not going after the problem that they had. We said, not, EMS or fire, first responder response. If you want to go to law enforcement, it needs to be, those sedans, marked or unmarked, or an SUV. Certainly can't be, and usually is not the case, but we wanted to spell out, certainly couldn't be a SWAT vehicle or something of, a corrections truck, a bus, something along those lines. So we were able to narrow it down and tie the definitions directly to those limited law enforcement vehicles. And again, the other thing that we did was make sure that this is not just a carte blanche. If you have this vehicle, you can park it wherever you want, even if it's not in an allowable parking environment. It still has to be parked in your designated, unit space, in your designated parking, driveway, whatnot. It does not just give you the ability to just pull up, leave it, park, and say, hey, that's a law enforcement vehicle. I can park it wherever I want. So it was working as we do with policymakers, knowing what they wanted to accomplish and achieve due to the actions of an association, but making sure that we had limited it in some way to make it workable.
So these two bills are in effect immediately. And so we're going to get into 140 quickly right now. So law enforcement vehicles, 476, again, just to keep checking on that. Condos, co-ops, HOAs applies to all. Senate Bill 140 with fireworks, Tony, that looks like that's an HOA bill, right?
Yeah, Bill, it's strictly HOA, and why the legislature decides to take up a bill like this with all the other important issues the state has to deal with, I don't know the answer to that, but nonetheless, with 4th of July right around the corner, those residents who reside in homeowners associations, based on this bill, will now be able to use fireworks within their HOA on the 4th of July, along with the New Year's Eve and New Year's Day. And irrespective of any restrictions that might be included in the board-made rules and regulations, they'll be able to use those fireworks. If the Declaration of Covenants has a restriction on fireworks, that's still going to be enforceable. But by board-made rule, the board can't, limit somebody's ability in a homeowners association to use fireworks on those 3 designated holidays.
Okay, very good. So, Travis, so an operational note here, condominiums can still pass rules regulating the use of fireworks. HOAs can do that as well, except for these 3 specific days. Same with law enforcement vehicles. So a reminder, right, for all of us to go back and review our rules and regulations. So we want to make sure that we update those and keep those, again, not in conflict with this new legislation. Travis, anything quickly to add on the fireworks legislation?
Again, one of those that had nothing to do with associations until late in the process, which is why we have to, as Tony said, why they would we have to stay on our game at all times. But this was originally, it was going to be 4 holidays. It was for the the fireworks issue that was saying Memorial Day was included, and then these other 3 that you could use fireworks that otherwise would be deemed illegal in the state, but on these 3 holidays, a way to you were free to go. Well, late in the process, language got added. There was somebody involved in the process that I think dealing with an association that in South Florida that had just passed rules and had said you're not going to use fireworks at all, and it had interaction with this particular situation. They came to the legislature and said, nope, we're going to say just for HOAs, again, not condos, not co-ops, but for HOAs, if you're going to prohibit them, it can't just be by a board rule. You've got to preclude that usage in your declaration. And so that ended up passing and also went to the governor early in the process before, everything else kind of happened. And so it got signed and went into effect immediately.
Good. The backstory, Travis, is always fascinating to me. Thank you, giving us insight into how this process works. Now, before we get into short-term rentals, Monique, let's talk about and advance to some of the bills that did not pass, and what are the ramifications for the 2021 perhaps legislative session if we have that. And we can move to the short-term rentals at this time. So this didn't pass, and we could start to move into it, but we do have some protection here now, Tony, and some additional clarification again, which is beneficial. If you could walk us through some of the details.
Well, this is obviously something that people have very strong passions about. You may have bought into your condominium community knowing that there was a restriction. You could only rent your unit maybe once a year, maybe for a minimum of 90 days, 6 months, maybe a 1-year minimum rental term. And now all of a sudden, through very powerful lobbying efforts on behalf of the short-term rental industry, the Airbnbs and the VRBOs, those companies have a very strong lobbying presence, not just here in Florida, but throughout the country. There's been a strong push the last several years to give an individual owner the right to rent his unit however he may choose, a short-term rental through Airbnb, daily rental, weekly rental, irrespective of any restrictions that might exist in the community's documents. So obviously that's something that evokes very strong passion among residents and communities who don't want the transient type occupancy in their communities. And we're not talking about communities that may have been created specifically to allow for the investor purchaser and the frequent rentals. We're talking about just in general and across the board effort on behalf of these short-term rental companies to force their way into these communities that may have had rental restrictions. So, it's as I said, it's something that evokes very strong passion among people. Most people don't want if they're residing in a community like that has had rental restrictions, they don't want the transient occupancy.
Yeah, and isn't it true too that kudos to our audience and to our board members who took the short-term rental survey that we shared with all of our clients, provided the feedback, right, Travis? And that was very helpful in helping to slow this down and move this forward.
Absolutely. I mean, well, to hit that point first, thank you to you, the associations and the association leadership that spread this information out to their communities, and then all of you got in contact with your legislators because they heard you. I can walk the halls, I can talk to members, I can present in committee, but they're used to seeing me or Tony. We go and do a lot of meetings, and they're used to seeing us. And quite honestly, they are assuming that we're there on behalf of a management company and a management interest, whereas on something like this, where it was very clear that we're dealing with the associations. They just think, well, so you guys just have more work to do because as a management company you don't want it because you have to do all this verification or whatnot. And when all of a sudden association members were telling their stories of, I bought into an association that was single family home, and now, we've got parties happening or we've got visitors, and it's a constant turnover. And now, especially as we're dealing with, a pandemic and a virus, being able to maintain control. And it's hard enough to now clean just for the residents that we have in the building, let alone people coming and going from all corners of the globe. For years, this issue has been the number one issue for associations, and we have all taken this on together. And the fight typically comes around what's called, and you hear about this and you don't really know what this is, and they talk about preemption. Well, what's preemption? And it's where the short-term rental operators or vacation rental operators, as Tony described, rather than wanting to deal with a patchwork of local regulation, where maybe the city of Fort Lauderdale has this rule, and Palm Beach County has a little bit different take and how they operate vacation rentals. And it's all over the state. You could have 67 counties and over 400 cities doing things differently. They want just, hey, treat us like the hotels, treat us, DBPR regulates the hotel and lodging industry. We want you to regulate it in whatever fashion and make it uniform. But the problem with that is a lot of times when they do preemption and we preempt something to the state for regulation, it's just really kind of another way of saying that they're not going to do anything, and that the regulations would not be nearly what we have on each individual local level. And so we were saying, until there's some statewide rules and regulations in place that we all think that associations are protected by, we don't want this just handed over. Preemption in and of itself isn't a bad thing. I mean, I want there to be a uniform system of traffic laws. I want where no matter what city I go in, a red light means stop, and a green light means go. And I don't have to worry about what each individual traffic signal colors are going to be and what they mean. But in this particular case, we wanted it to be very clear that associations should be able to control their neighborhoods and their buildings and their communities. So there were things in the bill. Let's just take this year's bill, for instance, that were very problematic, where we had language in there that said, you have a constitutional right to rent your property. Well, we said, this is going to create a problem when we're trying to tell people, your condo docs don't allow for this. And they then run around and say, well, the Constitution says I have a constitutional right. I don't care what and we said, that's going to create a problem. It then also said that vacation rentals are residential in nature. And we were saying, no, they are a commercial enterprise, or that's a public, that's a hotel, that's a transient lodging establishment. That's not residential. We are in a residential neighborhood. So that was a problem. Then they did agree to language that said, all right, associations, 718, 19, 20, you guys, does not affect you as your documents are right now. Well, that was a concern for us because associations should be able to amend their documents, as difficult as we've discussed as that is, but we didn't want it to be just locked in to say whatever July 1, 2020, whatever your documents say then, that's how your community is going to be forever and henceforth. We wanted to be able to say, no, we may want to be able to expand vacation rentals. We may want to limit them. We want that flexibility to do on a local controlling level. Trust us with that. So as Bill and Tony both mentioned, we were able finally to get the problematic language removed. We were able to get amended the language that said associations, whatever your documents say now or as amended, you control the issue. And for years, it was associations that basically have killed these bills. And this year, they finally realized, well, these bills are not going to pass unless we make the associations, somewhat happy. We have no chance. So we were able to get our stuff taken out of. So we said, look, we don't care about the preemption fight. You could have it controlled by Tallahassee. You could have it controlled locally. As long as we're okay and we're able to do and control our own neighborhood, we don't care about this larger preemption fight. But we didn't get comfortable, and we didn't get okay with that, and you didn't get okay with that, and tell the legislature, okay, we're okay, until literally the very last House committee meeting, and it was the very end of session. And at that point, it was too late for them to get this thing, and it just lost some steam. So it did not pass. So even if it had, we would have been okay, but it did not. So we are okay. But as Tony and Bill mentioned, and I think the last bullet point speaks to this, that I feel like going forward, this issue will be back. The economics are just too great that to ignore this issue. It will come back. But that associations are going to be in a good position, because I think we're in a position of being able to start kind of where we ended last year, which was finally getting some of this stuff resolved. But I will end again, because it bears repeating that none of this happens without your involvement. And I know we send out alerts, and I say to the team, I've got another alert that I need you to send out, and they send it out faithfully to you, and then you have faithfully responded. And not only were you responding and doing the emails and the calls, but I would go into committee meetings thinking, here I am going in to fight the fight alone, and literally there would be many of you in those committee meetings. And Tallahassee is not an easy place to venture to, and I'm not sure many want to venture to, but yet you were there and engaged and in the fight with us. And this is just one of those issues that we can't compromise on, because it would change the community the way it is, and it would change our ability to control whatever the issue is if we can't control this. I will finally say that even on HOAs, they have tried again to say, and they tried numerous times again this year, and we stopped it, fortunately, all of us together, but they tried language that would say, if your amendments if there's an amendment to rental restrictions to your documents, it only applies to those that consent, that vote yes. It only applies to them, or until you sell your home. And we said, again, we hate that language in condos. We definitely don't want that to go into HOAs. And we were able to keep that out. And that's, again, due to all of your work, but we got to stay vigilant on this issue.
Absolutely, and that's the thing. So we have another year, great work. It's good news that this bill did not pass, or these bills, the House and the Senate version. It will be back. The industry isn't going away. And I'll say, as we're buying time here, just looking at the market, some developers have identified an opportunity to sell units. And this doesn't prohibit those developers from building, and they're under construction now. Some are going to open soon in different markets. buildings and communities that are specifically set up with governing documents to support investor ownership and short-term rentals. And that's wonderful for a couple of reasons. Number one, again, you know what you're buying into. Number two, those investors that currently may own in a community today that does not allow for short-term rentals, and then the failing of these bills allows associations to control their own home and their own destiny, those investors may move over to this new product, these new developments, where they won't have the headaches. And so I think just legislation, we're going to stay on this. We're going to follow it every single year. We're going to continue. But I think that the most important components here is that, you know, things are getting better in this space and seem to be looking up, and associations are able to control their destiny. And that's what's really key, whether that's for short-term rentals or not for short-term rentals. And so, so great information. We'll keep everyone posted on this again as we go through next year. So thank you, Monique. Additional bills that did not pass, Tony, 623 or 689. You can take these in any order that you like.
Yeah, the first one, House Bill 623, Travis can comment on because he was very, very actively involved in this. And there's a lot of good things in there, cleanup. This was a collaborative effort to put this together between, you know, the interests involved with management companies, community associations, the attorneys, Florida bar attorneys who practice in this space. A lot of good cleanup stuff that was in this bill, Travis, but just didn't make it to the finish line.
Right, Tony. Every year there's a kind of an association package that gets developed that are things that we want that need to be cleaned up. Things from you know, in 2018 legislation passed that set up for condos a term limit for board members at 8 years. And there was some concern, some argument that, you know, when does the 8 years start? We had argued that it is, you know, prospective. It starts when that bill became law. The department for DBPR, for some unknown reason, for a moment there, they put out a ruling that said, nope, it's retroactive. And that created all kinds of confusion. Then they came back and said, oh, we were wrong. You're right. It's prospective. But we wanted to go into the law and make that very clear, that the 8 years start from that July, 2018 date. So language like that, language dealing with transfer fees. The transfer fees for many communities, it's been capped at $100. And again, you know, when a cap is put into place in the law, it stays there, and inflation and other things do not get a chance to take effect with it. So we said, you know, background checks are eating up now the majority of that transfer fee cost. If you're starting to do foreign background checks for an owner, maybe out of Brazil or Russia or somewhere, and for a couple, they're buying, so you have to have 2 background checks. It's taking up. So we wanted to increase that. There's an issue dealing with what's called subrogation, which is an insurance term that deals with, you know, one insurance company paying for something. And it's very much like our auto insurance here in the state of Florida, where, you know, my insurance company will fix my car, but if Tony's at fault, my insurance company subrogates and says, all right, we fixed his car, but your guy was at fault. We want the money. Well, we've had a situation where HO6 policies, the unit owner policy, were just throwing everything to the association and sending out demand letters and saying, hey, you know, we fixed this guy's unit, but this is your fault because there was some maintenance wasn't done. It's some stack up on the roof or whatever case, or even nothing, just saying you owe it. And associations were, you know, well, that's beyond even below our deductible. We don't know what to do. We'll just pay it, and we don't want to get sued. And we're seeing some of these where they were coming in where they were asking, you know, $15,000, and then literally the next letter that came in less than, 30 days later, it was gone to $42,000 and just was cranking. So we said we're gonna fix that. If an association can't subrogate against a unit owner can't subrogate against association. Each policy, the master and the associate should be handling their own policy, because that's what you're collecting the money for that premium for. So there was that issue that was embedded in there. We were dealing with some alternative dispute resolution. The process that is in place right now with arbitration for condominiums, quite honestly, just is not working. It used to be more robust at the department. You could go. It was a cheap, effective, efficient way of getting some disputes resolved, whether it was, noisy pets or what colors of paint. But that wasn't working, whereas the alternative dispute resolution process for HOAs seems to be working much better. So we said, let's allow condos that option. They can choose, but let's at least pull that in and allow that for an option. Things along those lines, meeting notices regarding posting the meeting notices on websites, using apps now, just kind of catch up with technology to allow for apps to be used to post information. One last thing, for some reason for HOAs, there was a tweak to the law a few years ago that resulted in an HOA, in order to use the addresses, they had to go to the county and get from the clerk or the court's office, the property appraiser's office rather, and get the information, and it was becoming extremely costly and extremely expensive instead of just using their own routes. So things along those lines that we got very close to being able to pass. And again, the way when session was ending, and with the virus now coming, and in fact there were House members that had tested positive, so they were things at the very end of session got very chaotic, and a lot of bills, as I mentioned at the outset, we had fewer bills passed than we have ever had. It just kind of got caught up in all of that, and this was one, along with these other three, that did not pass.
Tony, anything you'd like to add here?
No, as Travis said, Bill, every year there's this this type of bill which flows through the legislature that's designed to clean stuff up. Gone are the days, and Travis will remember back. Travis and I have been working together for almost 20 years, 18 years, I think. There were years where no community association legislation was passed, and that was thought to be a good thing. Let's live with it. Let's see where real problems are and then address them as we need to. Well, those days are long gone. I mean, every year there's a whole host of community association bills that are proposed. Some of them good, like this one. Some of them not so good. And it seems like we end up spending more time trying to keep the not so good bills from getting heard and passed than we do on pushing the good bills. So. This type of bill, the omnibus type bill, is going to be there every year from this point on, probably, just to try to clean up things that we find from experience, aren't working the way they should.
Well, and as Tony said, I mean, for associations, we have more associations in the state of Florida than any other state in the country. And when we pass something that affects how you handle a voting, mailing, notice, it takes a while for those associations to be able, and so we just don't think it's fair to change the game all the time, because just about the time associations are able to kind of figure out, okay, this is how it goes, it gets changed. So fortunately, First Services is there to help monitor all of those changes and incorporate them into the practice and manage administration of an association. But as Tony said, those days now, because there's so many associations. So every legislator could come with a horror story of some sort from their district now, and things happen, and we deal with them all the time now.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that as you noted, the number of associations, and we're seeing the power and the influence that the associations now have in Tallahassee, and that can be a good thing. So.
Right.
Monique, we're going to get it here into Q&A, but I think that let's talk about some involvement here for a moment. We're going to continue to work and provide information for all of our clients out there, board members, as well as our staff and managers, regional directors, vice presidents, keep everybody on the same page. Definitely make sure your voice is heard, and we're working everywhere from City Hall all the way up, as Travis mentioned, to Tallahassee. We do have some work to do as well. So it's, as we all know here in Florida, it's beginning early of hurricane season, so far an active storm season. We are still dealing, obviously, with a lot of COVID best practices, but I do hope that some of the information today can be implemented at your communities. Certainly reviewing those screening packages, orientation processes, rules and regulations, everything to make sure that you're in compliance and ahead of this. Some of the bills are in effect now, as we explained. Others will be in effect in 2 weeks. So we have a lot of work to do as management and as your support team to bring to the boards and get things cleaned up. As far as involvement, certainly you have two websites, the Senate and the House side, to please, as Travis mentioned, go online, look at the bills if you like, and look at the activity, look at the language, and if you'd like to do so. Travis, entering the bill number, right, in the space provided at the top of the page, and then you just have a couple notes on this?
Right. So both of these sites are very easy to use. The way the system works is all House bills are odd number. Senate bills are even number. So when you're putting the bill number, and they're all set, currently already set to 2020. If you wanted to look for a bill, say back in a previous year, you can hit the drop down there at the date and pick another session. But it's preset for these 2020 bills that we discussed. So if you just put the number, you don't have to worry about HB or SB. Just, you can put in the 374, and it's going to bring up the right bill because of the even odd way that they handle that system. So I would just mention real quick on the involvement that over half, because of the number of associations we now have, over half of Floridians live in some type of common interest ownership setting. And so when you say that, we're a huge a block of the population, that also, it's a huge voting block as well. And so not only is it a population numbers, voting numbers, that's getting more and more attention, and legislators and policymakers, whether it's, like you said, from the city level all the way up to DC, they're looking and listening to that. And then the other thing, quite frankly, is that, with COVID, and we're going into an election year, these folks are going to be on a lot of, Zoom town hall meetings, trying to do chats and emails and trying to get and reach out. You're not going to have to try to find a politician between now and November. They're going to be out there. And so make sure that you're letting them know, hey, I live in such and such an association, and these are our feelings about these issues that affect associations, so that when we're dealing with them in Tallahassee, they know in their mind, all right, these are my constituents, care about these issues.
Great, excellent. Tremendous number of questions coming through today. Really, really great questions, gentlemen. So pull up your bootstraps here. We're gonna run through a lot of these. A lot of activity here around the service animals. So a few here, Tony, Travis. The first one I have is, our association has a limit. This is interesting, the details. A limit of 1 pet per condo. Is a pet legally different than a service animal? Can a service animal be designated as the owner's one and only pet, so they cannot have more than 1 pet? Is there a limit on the number of service animals an owner can have? So right now, this distinction, Tony, pet, service animal, and emotional support animal.
So yeah, Bill, I think a lot of these questions the association is going to need to discuss with its attorney. What we do know is, generally speaking, the provisions of law allowing for an emotional support animal override pet restrictions that are in documents. So if the documents say you can have 1 pet, only 15 pounds or less, an owner who has a qualified ability to request an emotional support animal and support from the provider, medical provider, healthcare provider, in favor of that individual's ability to qualify for an emotional support animal, they can have that animal irrespective of the weight limit in the documents, irrespective of the limit in the documents on the number of pets. So if an owner has a pet and then develops a disability that requires an emotional support animal, the owner wouldn't necessarily be limited by the fact that they already have a pet. So the emotional support animal application has to be treated separate and apart. There are limitations certainly on the animal can't be a risk to other residents in the community. The owner has to still walk the dog and allow the dog to relieve itself in properly designated areas. You know, all those things are still going to apply, but the limitations that may exist on weight or on the number of pets, the law is very specific in terms of an owner is not limited to one emotional support animal. If they can produce documentation, reliable documentation that supports that individual's ability to have two emotional support animals, they're able to have two emotional support animals. So all those things, you know, that may have been limitations under the existing documents, you now have to look separately at the application for an emotional support animal.
And Bill, I would add, and Tony's exactly right. And at the outset, let me say again that what we passed, that we talked about, that's now before the governor, and we suspect he will approve it, does not deal with every single issue where we'll no more ever be having to question and talk about emotional support animals. It's the beginnings of that, of providing some framework, some penalties, that kind of thing. I would also encourage everybody to go and look at that bill. It's not a long bill. It's an easy bill to read. It's very understandable. There's an analysis, a staff analysis that's even, you know, has even more. It's not in legalese. And so it's important to read that and understand that, and certainly provide that, you know, information, give it to your attorney and say, hey, how does this affect us in our documents? The other thing I would say is, service animals, you got these three categories. You have service animals, emotional support animals, and pets. A service animal is not considered a pet. It is a animal that is dealing with a readily identifiable disability. So a disability that you can see that this person is unique in some way. And
like
has
a C9 dog or something.
Right. Right. And you can see that. And then it is documented. And in order to be a service animal, you can't just designate it and slap a patch on it and say, this is a service animal. It has to be that it's performing a function, and it performs that function for that person. But then and it has to go through that process. But once it's designated as a service animal, you can't treat it like a pet. So to answer the question, and then I'll leave it at this, if there's a service animal, you've got to take that off of the equation of whether or not does it qualify as the pet? Because it is not a pet. It is there to do a job, and it is not, so they could have the service animal and still a pet, because the service animal does not, doesn't take the space of the pet, position.
And great job there. You actually answered a couple of the additional questions that came in around this. One more quick question before I shift gears. Generally speaking, this legislation goes into effect hopefully July 1st, and it helps us. We had that established. What about pets that are already in the building, guys? Can we go back and ask to another question even goes as far as to say a biannual recertification. So what are some high level thoughts on how we can address that with the new legislation, or is it just is what it is in the building or in the HOA?
Well, the association certainly can go back and request updated information. For example, the emotional support animal has to be they have to provide proof of vaccination. The dog has to be licensed, properly licensed. So certainly the association can go back and request updates to that information, because the license will expire, the vaccinations need to be redone periodically. So that's certainly within the association's power to request that updated information be provided.
Good. Okay. And And I think that's what's important here is to understand that we can update, and specifically the sources of these certificates. I love our attendees. One of the questions used to quote unquote phony baloney information that we're receiving, and it's in good humor, but it's also true, right? We're all spending a lot of time processing this work and trying to do what's right for the association. But I do think it's important to go back through perhaps and make sure we have valid information to begin with. This law should help us with that.
And for Florida, where we're requiring them to have seen a medical provider through either telehealth or in person. For out-of-state providers, so this is again is trying to get to this certificate print-off.
Right.
For out-of-state providers who are certifying the need for the ESA, that they have to certify that they have seen the patient in person on at least one occasion. So they have to have done, they have to have been that person's maybe attending physician or something in another state, because part of the way the punishments and everything work for fraud is going after, is going to the license of the healthcare provider. And so we have to so we're able to say, okay, well, it's a state of Florida provider. If it's not, then you have to at least have been able to say, okay, sure, you saw that person in your state before you came here, but at least you saw them. And that was the big issue that the legislature really wanted to tackle with this. The main thing, and then it'll be expanded as we go forward. But that was to just stop this going online, plunking down your credit card. You haven't seen them, they haven't seen you, they don't know anything about your animal, your issues, and just saying, okay, send me the patch, send me the certificate, and now I can get my association off my back. And now, like you said, also the association can go back and say, hey, this new law passed. We now are updating our records. We want documentation.
Great.
And Travis,
Yep.
And Travis, as you mentioned, the state of Florida, as to a Florida healthcare provider who's providing this certification, they're subject to discipline by the state if they, are not providing accurate information or they're misrepresenting situations. And also the owner requesting the approval of an emotional support animal is now subject to criminal penalty in the state of Florida if they're presenting fraudulent information to the association.
And we're just hoping that will provide also, again, another layer of deterrent.
Yeah, and I think so, and certainly for those disclaimers and disclosures moving forward, that the association's checking this information, that the association says, and again, your attorney will polish the verbiage that can be printed, but I think that it's going to help mitigate false applications, the phony baloney information before it starts. So another good question here on the insurance on the FIGA legislation. If our building is insured with a non-admitted carrier, does FIGA still pay? Good question. We're always pushing very hard for all, because we've seen carriers become insolvent and fail. Unfortunately, it's based on experience, but we're always pushing for paper and admitted carriers. Do you guys know if does the FIGA still pay if it's a non-admitted, if an association ends up with that type of policy?
No, surplus lines, those non-admitted carriers do not participate in FIGA, either the giving or the paying in or receiving. A lot of these surplus lines companies, quite frankly, are rated very well, AM Best rated, or various rating agencies. I mean, we're talking, those are like, the Lloyd's of London type programs that are out there. And those really even aren't our concern. Those aren't the ones that Tony had mentioned, to the 600 and some that have gone under in the last 50 years that FIGA has been around. Those are admitted carriers. And this is where the state has said, yep, you financially, you're able to, these rates are filed and approved and you're able to operate here. Surplus lines, non-admitted carriers, this does not apply to.
Okay, good. Thanks for that clarification. Great question there. Moving now to short-term rentals. A lot of activity here. First question, our governing documents prohibit rentals of less than 90 consecutive days. Aside from fines or right suspensions, how can an association legally enforce the rental rules? Tony, would you like to start us off with that? I have some additional commentary here as well.
Yeah, I mean, from a legal standpoint, any violations, you can fine somebody, but some people may ignore the fine. They're making a lot of money off the short-term rental. So what? They'll pay the fine and still make enough money to make it worth their while. Eventually, somebody who's not complying with the rental restrictions or most other restrictions, the association is going to get to the point where they need to start with attorney demands and filing arbitration actions to enforce the restrictions.
Agreed. And what we're seeing now as well in communities, it's just an interesting perspective here where technology has enabled short-term rentals, the VRBOs of the world and the Airbnbs, and these platforms have really enabled the short-term rental industry. But one thing that we always focus on as well as enforcement, and then I want to go back to that, are access control systems. And the old saying, fight fire with fire. So let's fight technology if you want to get a better handle on this in your community with technology. And so, we're upgrading communities with smart lock systems and tightening up access control systems and purging and updating information, even if you have a key fob system or even still a key system in some cases, just to make sure that we all know. I will say that I'm seeing this in communities who want to get better at controlling ingress, access control to the community, but I'm also seeing it in the new buildings that are being developed for short-term rentals. It turns out there's a lot of alignment there. Those investors do not want their tenants, their guests, and their units for 1 day or 5 minutes longer than what they paid for that long weekend. And so they want to make sure that that fob expires and that the vehicle is left, and there's new technology. So we're focusing on that and working on that with the short-term rental piece. So good stuff still to come there, and that should help. I think finally, Tony, you had mentioned, and Travis, I'd like to pull you in for any commentary as well. If you're really serious about this, you end up legally, you end up in a process, right? You end up in some sort of legal process at the court. And I've seen communities be very aggressive, and it really does set a statement in the community, and perhaps for future buyers or investors, hey, listen, the association's willing to take this further. Can you comment on what that might look like if you really just run out of options?
Well, it is very important, Bill. Nobody likes to deal with lawyers. Lawyers aren't cheap, and associations end up running up legal bills. But you get to a point in certain situations where that is your recourse. And if you don't take advantage of that recourse, then you're going to impact your ability to enforce that particular restriction going forward. So it's important, and I think you mentioned earlier, Bill, associations need to look at their rules and regulations periodically and clean up things that are in there that maybe are not being enforced, because it taints everything. If you've got a series of rules and regulations and people look at it and say, oh yeah, they don't enforce that, they don't enforce that. So you need to look at your rules, tighten things up, and if there are provisions that are in your document, same thing. You need to try and get rid of things that don't no longer apply and that aren't being enforced. It's very important that you do that. And as I said, if you don't enforce, it's going to impact those things that are important that you do want to enforce. If you don't enforce them, you're going to impact your ability going forward to enforce those restrictions. Good.
Thank you. Travis, this next one, we're getting close now. I'm going to get as many in here as I can. Here's something that's a little bit different. Will the HOAs, do you think, at some point be required to have websites similar to condos? Just disclosure, we provide them automatically to every single client. It's part of the service culture and 24/7 service culture, right? But legislatively, do you see that coming up for the HOAs out there?
Yeah, as of now, no, that they do not. It does not apply to HOAs or to co-ops. It only applies to condominiums by law. They have tried, every year as we talk about these bills that get filed, to change the percentages of how many units, the threshold before you then have reached the requirement that you have to have one, both in condos. They tried to add HOAs to it, but nothing had passed this year dealing with that. So obviously for this next year, it will not affect HOAs. I'm hesitant to say going forward. I mean, I think maybe in the future that may be something that does happen, but right now they're focusing more on the fact that a condo is different than an HOA, and it's just a different nature of living, and so that's a requirement that they're comfortable, that the majority of the legislature is comfortable just leaving that with condos. But again, anything can change. I did want to mention that I saw one question on the ESA that it did originally filed, dealt with just landlord tenant, but then we were able to very quickly get it amended to include all housing providers, which condominiums would be included in that. And then going back to the short-term rental issue on just enforcing the rules, when you start taking away rights as based on the ability, because they've been fined so many times or they're delinquent or whatever, and your documents allow for you to start, you start taking away things like rental voting rights and other things from owners, it starts to get their attention. And then, like you said, the technology, I've heard of an association that said, well, we have to provide you access to the association, to the neighborhood. That's a right that we can't deny, but we don't have to make it easy for you. You don't no longer get to go through the resident gate where it's just reading your car scanner and lifting the gate and allowing you in. Now we're going to turn that off. That's a privilege, and so we're now going to remove that, and you're going to now have to go through and just, I've heard, that those types of measures start getting people's attention very quickly.
Yeah, good. Okay, one more question I think we can get in here. What session would be these days, right, without coronavirus or COVID-19 coming up? Do you guys anticipate any coronavirus legislation? I'll start off by saying I think from an operational perspective, what we're seeing are just the protocols, and some of the best practices will continue into the future. So in reality, we're forecasting, we're looking at budgets, we're looking at all of that to continue these best practices just to keep every single community safer and cleaner and healthier for all of our residents and guests. Do you guys see anything from a legislative perspective that might come through?
Well, and I'll take a step at that. We've been dealing with the federal government, with the legislative session being over. They're not there to deal with issues, and a lot of the issues are coming, need to be really dealt with from a federal level. I think when the legislature does get back, they're going to be dealing with things like the emergency powers. We were able to work, to get the emergency powers kind of expanded just by for a moment through the DVPR secretary's announcement that, because the law triggers that with a natural disaster, because we've used it just for hurricanes, and we've said, well, this is not a natural disaster, but this is something that is, that we need to be able to access those. We can't meet in person, so we've got to be able to and those kinds of things I think will go into the law, and they'll make those tweaks to emergency powers and to those kinds of things. But the other stuff they'll be dealing with, I think, from a coronavirus level, are economic, dealing with the unemployment program, the unemployment compensation. On the federal level, we're dealing with things like the moratorium on debt collection. We've been meeting with Senator Rubio's office, Senator Scott's office, members of our congressional delegation. We certainly are in support of the hold on foreclosures that's in effect till July 1. But then, when you get to the debt collection, there's legislation in Washington that would say you can't do any debt collection for 120 days, like 4 months, after the emergency is passed. So we're dealing, that could significantly cripple an association at the time when we're being told to stay at home. So therefore, home is what we need to be keeping safe by doing the things that require us to do the cleaning, the elevator maintenance, all of those things that the association does. So we're working on that, making sure that the associations aren't impacted by that. We want them to be included in this housing assistance fund that they're working to put together, to say that association dues and assessments should be included in that, as some people could apply for and get. The Paycheck Protection Program, saying, associations were not included in that because of the way our not-for-profit corporation status was set up, even though there clearly are some associations that have employees. Others are just pass through and they're employees of the management company or others, but having them included in that. The big thing too, and this will be a state issue as well, is limiting liability for, and no offense to Tony and the other wonderful attorneys that we work with, but this could become a real boon for liability if an association thinks, well, I'm going to get sued. My insurance prohibits, there's an exclusion for virus, so I have no insurance coverage. They're not going to pay the legal bill or the claim on that. So I'm hesitant to open up my amenities and other things because the association, the board, we may be exposed to liability just because we're trying to follow the rules. So working on limiting that liability, that exposure to associations, we're working on a federal level, and that also will be on a state level as well.
Good. Okay, Monique, let's provide the resources here. Thank you all very much. There are so many questions we couldn't get to yet, and I know that there's going to be additional questions as you think about and deliberate the information today with your fellow board members. Therefore, please note this and this designated email address, clientexperience.fl@fsresidential.com. We'll make sure to get back to all questions that we don't have answered yet, and we'll get those right over to the right subject matter experts to get you those answers there. Comprehensive legislative alert that you all may or may not have yet received. There's the website for that. Again, remember, this is all recorded, so no need to scramble for a pen and a piece of paper here. But we will have that on our website so that you can all print and download and take a look at and refer back to as needed. And then, of course, our COVID-19 Resource Center is on our website. Here's a shortened version of the link. But our entire library and document resource center is available to refer back to all of this information. Now, finally, I just want to take a moment to thank, Tony, Travis, you guys, you're the best in the business. Thank you so much for your time today and your attention this year. And again, great work. I feel like every year we're making progress and great steps. Board members, community leaders on the phone, thank you all again for your support, for your attention, and for being involved and educated in these sessions, and for what you're doing for your community at the end of the day. We sincerely appreciate it, and I know that your residents do too, even if that's not what you hear every day in your community. So again, thank you all so much. We're wrapping up just about on time. Have a great rest of the week, and until next time, we look forward to your questions, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you.
Thanks.